Hey, it's Luxury Travel Docs here today, and today we are at the Booker T. Washington National Monument in Hardy, Virginia. Now, who was Booker T. Washington? I'm sure you have heard that name over the years as one of the most famous former slaves ever in the United States. And he has a very interesting story. Booker T. Washington was born into slavery in the late 1850s. Now, the exact year of his birth is really unknown. He said he never knew what it was, but he thought it was in 1858 or 1859, but records show it was probably in 1856. His mother was a slave at the Burroughs Plantation in what was then Hales Ford, Virginia, and she was the plantation cook. Booker T. Washington talks about his early years on the plantation with as much detail as he could provide. And at the National Monument, which I am in right now, you can see right behind me some of the types of buildings that Booker T. Washington would have lived in. The building over my left shoulder is the kitchen for the plantation where his mother would have cooked, and over my right shoulder on your left side is the type of cabin that Booker T. Washington and his brothers and sisters would have lived in. These had earthen floors. They had no way of heating them or cooling them, since we are in the mountains of Virginia. And it could have been a very difficult existence in the summer or in the winter time. And he talks about that in his memoirs, which I'll get to in a moment. The Burroughs Plantation had a little over 200 acres, and it was a working tobacco farm. And the outline of the original plantation house is also right over my shoulder, and it's surprisingly very small. The National Park Service, who now runs this site, has recreated not only the buildings that you see over my shoulders, but also has recreated other parts of the ground. And this continues to be a working farm where they grow things such as tobacco, which was grown during the time of Booker T. Washington, but also raise animals such as sheep, pigs, horses, cows. You can see all of those here, much in the same areas where they were when Booker T. Washington was a child here. He gives a few stories about living here on the plantation. For example, he used to walk his mistress to the schoolhouse, and in the schoolhouse he could see the students who were studying there, and he thought that it looked like paradise. So early on he had ideas of attending school. Also, he had as one job to take corn to the local mill, and that was about 3 miles away, and he had to walk through very dense forests at that time. And the thing that he was most afraid of were deserting rebel soldiers. And the story goes that if one of these rebel soldiers came across a Negro boy, that they would cut off his ears. And he was very much afraid of this. Of course, he talks about some of the regular whippings that would occur if somebody didn't do the things that they were supposed to do, but he also speaks very fondly of the relationships of the slaves to the plantation owners. The other interesting story that Booker T. Washington talks about is the day that he learned of his potential and then later actual freedom. He remembers his mother waking him and his brothers and sisters up in the middle of the night saying that freedom was not far away, and apparently that was right after the Emancipation Proclamation that was signed by President Lincoln. And then ultimately, the day that Booker T. Washington definitively learned of his freedom was right behind where I'm standing now, right in front of the recreated slave cabin. On the steps of the plantation home, a Union officer came declaring that the slaves were hereby and eternally freed, and that is the day that his family learned of their freedom. They subsequently went to West Virginia to be with Booker T's stepfather and older brother, where he ultimately worked in what was coal mines and salt mines, earning money and also teaching himself to read. He went on to earn more money and ultimately attained an education at Hampton University, which was then a recently opened university. He went on ultimately to teach there and was asked to eventually teach at Tuskegee College in Alabama, where he was one of the founders of that college, essentially. He went on to be very famous to promote the education of African Americans, and he spoke very frequently with many prominent individuals during the early part of the 20th century. Booker T. Washington died in 1915, but his impression and legacy in the United States of America is so fondly remembered by many. To learn more about this story, I highly encourage you to go to the Apple Podcast Store and download Booker T. Washington's book, Up From Slavery, which is free as a podcast on the Apple Podcast Store. It is read as Booker T. Washington wrote it, and I think you will find it extremely interesting. So always remember to make meaningful and healthy travel happen for yourself, even if the weather is bad, as you can see that it is here today. But we highly encourage you to visit the Booker T. Washington National Monument in Hardy, Virginia, if you're in the Western Virginia area. So thanks again for joining us. And as always, please follow us on Facebook or follow our webpage, luxurytraveldocs.com. And if you like our content, become a subscriber to our YouTube channel. We really, really appreciate your support. Thanks again.